Welcome to Noon, a Daraj Media feminist podcast. In this episode of Noon, we will be speaking with Anna Zoubnina. Anna, welcome first to Beirut and to our studio. You're from Russia, you're a feminist, you're a researcher, and you have extensive experience with policy work, feminist analysis. I know you've done a lot of work as well on prostitution. This is the main topic that we'll discuss today. And obviously, we have you here as the executive director, strategy and executive director of the European Network of Migrant Women. So welcome again, and really thank you for giving us your time. So as I said, the focus is the topic of the sex trade and prostitution. First, I want to ask you, what sparked your interest in advocating against the sex trade?
That's a good question because it's a little bit relevant to Lebanon. I used to live in Cyprus. I left Russia when I was in my early 20s, when I was 20. And in Cyprus, where I moved with my two little kids, I was studying sociology, and I chose to do my master on discourse analysis on basically women in prostitution. I wanted to analyze what exactly women in prostitution say, what they think themselves, what are their words, how they understand what is happening. And as you probably know, in Cyprus, at least at that time, it was 2000, there were a lot of women from post-Soviet Union, different countries, but a lot of them from Russia itself, and then other republics of the former Soviet Union. So a lot of Russian-speaking women who were in prostitution in Cyprus. And this is how I could have easier access to those women. I could find them. I knew the locations where prostitution was happening. And I got to know several of those women quite closely. You know, I can't say that we became friends, because one of the things that I learned is that for women in prostitution, the very idea of human friendship is almost impossible. Because when you spend day and night in a context that is dependent on selling a woman to a man and making profit out of the selling of a woman, and when a man is exclusively somebody who pays, has the potential to pay, but also has the potential to hurt you, to kill you, to rape you, and a woman, let's say in a brothel, is only presented to you as your potential competitor to this man who is going to pay for you. It completely destroys the very possibility of human trusts and building relationship and friendship based on trust. And I'm mentioning this because this struck me as one of the saddest things about prostitution, just by speaking to these women and understanding how much it takes to gain even a little bit of trust from these women, because they live in a constant under constant pressure of being betrayed by others. But so this is a context. I was always interested in women's rights, but this was, for me, prostitution itself. I thought that it's an interesting, it's an interesting, part of society where we can really see how stereotypes operate and how inequality between women and men becomes very, very obvious. And this is why I wanted to analyze how these women think themselves, how they see what is happening to them and in this environment where they are. And what I learned from speaking to these women, interviewing them, having coffee with them, sitting in the evening in the bar and having a glass of wine with these women, was, apart from the fact that every single one of them did not want to be in this environment. If you give them a chance immediately to get out and do something different and have a different income, all of them would be out.
We're going to talk about this a bit more. It was useful for me also to know where you come from, and like I understand as feminists we should care about this. Can you share maybe an experience you witnessed or a story you heard that stuck with you?
It's not just one story, because I heard it repeatedly. It is the shock, psychological and physical shock of women after or during the very first confrontation with the buyer. I have not heard the stories from these women where they say, oh, it went very well, or he was wonderful. Women really expressed feeling violated, feeling raped, feeling defiled, feeling that they really lost something. And this was, for me, this was very, very profound understanding of, because as women, I was not in prostitution, but I have experience of sexual violence, like overwhelming majority of women have this experience. We all can relate to the feeling of being touched in a way that we don't want to be touched, or being called something that we don't want to be called, you know, like catcalling in the streets. I think it is something that we all can relate to. And this was, for me, a very clear breach and understanding that this was just an extreme of something that I experienced here and there in my life, but these women were subjected to this on a daily basis.
But you said it was sexual violence,
Yeah.
and most women experience
Yes.
sexual violence at least once in their lifetime. Why is it that so many women and feminists out there stop perceiving it as sexual violence as soon as they're paid money?
Yeah, this is one of the fundamental advocacy issues in our work, to exactly bring attention to the fact that payment, the presence of money, does not change the fact of violence. I think one important reason is because both feminists and overall human rights milieu are very under the influence of the neoliberal ideology and marketization, where everything is for sale, and money and transactional value of, you know, a lot of aspects of our life. It becomes, in a sense, commercialized, and the lines are becoming blurred. And I think that it is precisely our job as feminists to have those lines very clear, where it is permissible to pay for something, and where we are in the realm where it is parts of ourselves or of our identity that are not possible. It shouldn't be permissible to commercialize, like human dignity or human body as such. Why so many do not realize where this line is crossed? Well, as I said, one big contextual factor is, I think, the neoliberalization of pretty much everything in this world, but also a strong influence of those actors who have commercial financial interest in maintaining the industry of prostitution and keep generating profit. Because like with other profit generating industry, like take, I don't know, tobacco or alcohol or arms trade, you know, you have lobbyists and you have representatives of the industry, and sometimes those industries are very smart and they appoint and select spokespersons who really conceal who is really behind those industries. And the sex trade in particular was very successful in manufacturing the discourse and recruiting spokespersons whose purpose actually is to blur those lines in the minds of those people who are not very informed about the subject and who didn't take time to really understand the substance and the you know, the motives behind the existence of this trade.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, they succeeded in many ways in just hiding the true nature, of the act of prostitution. And I know that in one of your papers, Women, Migration and Prostitution in Europe, Not a Sex Work Story, you challenge the notion of sex work. And actually, it's an ongoing debate with my friends and feminist friends and the younger generation even. Like, they're like, fine, but all our jobs, are full of exploitation. We live in a neoliberal system, but how can we improve our conditions? Because there's so many other jobs out there in the world that are exploitative by nature, or maybe not, but the conditions are not so great. But let's go back to this, you challenging that notion of sex work, if we can explain it a bit to those listening to us.
Why it is not work, why prostitution is not work, and not sex either. Well, I understand the general logic of those who say that there is a lot of exploitation and exploitation present everywhere. And sometimes they bring up examples of men doing mining or somebody working in McDonald's or domestic workers who are cleaning toilets. There is a really significant difference between prostitution and all of those examples. First of all, is that you really cannot compare a manual labor that you do in order to earn money with a labor of a, well, let's say, customer, even though in our language it's not a customer, but if we adopt the terminology of the market, so you have a customer and you have the client and the seller. What happens in prostitution is that the so-called client actually performs some actions inside your body. You cannot compare it with me going and cleaning a table or a bed or caring for a disabled person and changing their diapers, for example. Speaking of which, so there is a nursing occupation, and sometimes, of course, we come very close to human body, nurses, and people can be severely disabled, and this exposes the nurse to human fluids, for example, and the human skin. And what do they usually do? There is a very strict code for medical institutions, right? So you use antiseptics, you wear gloves, you wear very often protective uniform.
Yeah.
This is all part of the job. This is not what's happening in prostitution. What is happening is exactly the opposite. The prostitution market will collapse very quickly if you introduce the rules that are applicable in other industries with which they're trying to compare prostitution. One of them is what I described just now, is the way we're coming in contact with other human bodies. The second one is norms on sexual harassment and sex discrimination at work. So in the European legislation, we have sex discrimination from which sexual harassment is part of sex discrimination. And we have an extensive body of precedents, court cases, where it was elaborated what actually constitutes sexual harassment in the workplace. Unwanted touching, obviously, but also even looking at somebody in a way that is inappropriate for the work context. And this would apply for any occupation, except one, if we consider, and it will be prostitution. Because sexual harassment in this particular occupation constitutes the very nature of work. And I have not seen one single country that went the route of legalization, of like presenting prostitution as occupation. Take example of Germany, where they really went down to define what would be the difference between the job and the sexual harassment. It is not in the labor code how prostitution is supposed to deal with this aspect. What would it be? I mean, what you said exactly, the advocates of the so-called sex work are successful in concealing what is the act in prostitution. And it is very, very important to really speak, and it's very uncomfortable conversation, especially for women.
Yeah.
What is happening in the act of prostitution is in relation to the labor norms on sexual harassment or violence. What are you going to say? It's okay to be penetrated by 2 penises, but not by 4 penises, because this would constitute sexual violence. When they offer what they call the gangbangs, and there are several men who are basically raping one woman, and it is official, it is, you know, it's advertised, it's on the menu of some of those brothels. Does it constitute sexual violence?
What do they say, as long as she consented, that it doesn't constitute?
Of course. No, of course, yes. It's part of entertainment package. So you can get one woman, and it can be 4 men getting one woman for various acts. It is really up to those men once he or they enter the room with a prostituted woman and the door is closed. There's no way. There are no cameras in those rooms. There is, because, you know why? Because this would be the violation of privacy of the customer. He never consented to being recorded and having his information potentially stored on files, which would be also the violation of privacy laws in the European Union, obviously. Because you see, they say, it's, the whole argumentation around this business is so self-contradictory. They, on the one side, they say it's a job. It's a job like any other, blah, blah, blah. On the other hand, they say, well, you shouldn't bother about what consenting adults do in their bedroom. But it's not just a bedroom. A minute ago, it was a job, and if it is a job, obviously, it is the business of the state to regulate, because this is what state is doing. Otherwise, I mean, we're not living in an anarchy. So the labor laws, they are produced by state, and they're supposed to apply to every sector of labor market, except prostitution, because then all of a sudden it becomes just a private bedroom between the 2 consenting adults, and nobody is supposed to know what is happening there, and it's none of their business. The only solution that they have found to extreme levels of violence, including femicide, that is very frequent in prostitution, is installing some kind of emergency buttons in the rooms where these women are, or making sure that the room does not have. So, for example, this environment will be very unsafe. If I was in prostitution and if you were the client, I would want this glass object to be removed, this glass object not to be here, because this will be potential murder weapon. And all the women who are in this business, they know it very well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like the state will only interfere in a life-threatening condition.
Yes, but not even this. They don't even interfere. I mean, it very much depends on the legislation and on the country. So those countries that really formally legalize prostitution as a job, even they did not go as far as to give the state the full authority to control what is happening within this prostitution transaction or environment.
Unlike other so-called jobs where they control every detail of what you go through. Yeah.
What most often what happens is that they either delegate this from the state level to not even to the municipal level. It's really up to cantons or municipalities to decide on specific rules. But another way they try to kind of circumvent the whole labor regulations, even though they treat it as a form of labor, is by giving the responsibility for this control of labor standards to a pimp. And so what happens, first of all, is the only so-called occupation where you have the employer being fully in charge of the so-called labor standards. Normally, there is a higher authority who is going to check this. But how, and also how they check it, well, does she have bruises? Does she cry? Oh no, she doesn't cry, she doesn't have bruises, so
So you just described the legalization model. There are other legal approaches to prostitution. If we can summarize those, because I think people think the only model is either we prohibit it or we legalize it, but there's more to that.
Yes, definitely. But speaking of legalization, it's important to clarify that very close to legalization, there is a model um, that is quite promoted at the moment, and it's called decriminalization. A lot of proponents of those who say sex workers work, they like to use this model as a best practice of the legal approach to prostitution. When they say decriminalization, what most people hear is the decriminalization of the persons exploited in prostitution, which of course overwhelming majority of them are women. So when we hear decriminalization, we think, oh, it's good because women will be decriminalized, they will not be punished, they will not be subjected to fines or criminal punishment. However, what is decriminalized in this case is not just the women, but every actor involved in the system of prostitution. And this means pimps, those who organize prostitution. They make sure that the industry is running and is making money, that there are women for sale, that there are men who are there to buy those women. Sometimes they act as managers. This would be in a legalized context, but sometimes they could really act as traffickers who bring women. They make sure that women are moved from one location or from one country to another country. And then there are buyers, the final users, who are there and without whom the whole prostitution would just crumble because there's no one to pay for the act. So what the decriminalization model supposedly does is removes completely any legal restrictions or regulations or punishment from all the parties involved in prostitution. This model, as I said, is being promoted as the best practice. It is desirable by, especially by pimps, because hooray, you're not controlled by the state, you don't need to pay the taxes, you do whatever you want, there's no accountability. And of course, it is the desirable model by those men who buy women in prostitution because it really completely protects their interests. By leaving them in the shadow, it protects their anonymity. There is no action that can be taken against them, except if a woman decides to file a complaint against the man for rape or burglary. Robbery is quite common when women get robbed by the men who come to buy them. And this, I will not go into this, but it means very lengthy, protracted legal cases where women find themselves, she cannot say directly that he is the perpetrator. She has to take him through this. The act of being violated in prostitution is not the act of violence per se. It has to be some horrific form, such as he came to set my house on fire or he tried to murder me. Then it becomes a case where you can try to pursue justice through the
So it has
legal
to be
system.
accompanied by another
Yes,
crime.
yes,
But
yes.
also, I mean, it's decriminalized, it's normalized, but at the same time, it shouldn't happen near nursery or
Yes.
other places, that
Yes, even
hospitals
though,
maybe.
even though the common narrative is that decriminalization has nothing to do with legalization, or it is much better than legalization. Because in legalization, the bottom line of legalization is that state becomes the main profiteer of prostitution. And this is why we use the term the pimp state. So you can have a pimp as an individual or a network of criminals, but it can be actually the whole state. And so they're supposed to tax brothels, pimps, but also women. Women, for example, in Germany, a woman who goes and she wants to be in prostitution in this particular location on this street, there are meters, like parking meters. So if she wants to stand there, or if her pimp wants her to stand there, she has to press a button and pay, I don't know, 10 euros per hour to be allowed to be. But this is like a rent, basically, of a public space. So this is how the state earns, and they come up with different approaches how to extract some
Can't
profits.
believe that it monetizes even the act of standing up in the street.
Yes, exactly. But in decriminalization, this act of profiting by the state, it actually stays, because yes, they're not criminals. Women are criminalized. The pimp is not a criminal. This doesn't prevent state still interfering and telling the women, for example, that they have to do regular health checks if they wish to be engaged in this occupation. What does it mean, regular health checks? That means only one thing, that the men who come to use women in prostitution wants to be sure that they're good men, that they do not contract HIV or some other sexually transmitted disease.
That they remain healthy.
Yes, it is exclusively about protection.
They don't test the men.
No. Not only they don't test the men, nobody knows who the men are. The men who come to those brothels, they do not leave their ID. They do not sign some paper, you know. Neither they, when they return back home to their wives, and most of them are married or in relationship, they do not tell them, oh, darling, I just came from a wonderful experience in a brothel. The system works in such a way as to protect the buyer, keep his anonymity, and make sure that he gets the most, whatever he wants to get out of this. So this is the rationale of both decriminalization and legalization, and they're very closely related. There is, when you look at practical details of how those models implemented, there's very little difference, except perhaps some grand taxation schemes that the state would come up with.
This is all very clear and useful. But just to have a minute or two to speak about the abolitionist movement and approach, to explain it to people and how it differs from prohibitionism and full criminalization. So there's this model known as the Nordic model, centering the survivor and providing survivors with protection and also exiting programs and avenues. So can you just briefly, 101?
Yes. So the Nordic model, the name comes because it was invented in Sweden. Sometimes we call it also the Swedish model, but another name is equality model, but otherwise abolitionist model. The main goal of this model is to really abolish the system of prostitution entirely. It is to build a society, to reach a place where no woman is commercialized and commodified for male consumption. It's as basic as that. Now, how do we reach this goal? But this distinction is important because it's entirely antithetical to what other models pursue. What they say is, it's okay for a man to buy a woman. There's nothing wrong with this. So here we start with the assumption that no, it's not okay. Women are not sexual commodities. So to reach this place where women are not commercialized and men do not wake up in the morning thinking that they can have access to a woman sexually because they can pay for it, there are practical solutions. Solution number one is, first of all, of course, if a woman or any person exploited in prostitution is criminalized, we remove all criminal charges, and this person is understood as a victim of systemic discrimination, because we know that prostitution is an outcome of systemic, historic, widespread discrimination against women, inequality between women and men. So women will be understood as having ended in prostitution because of very unfortunate circumstances of discrimination and inequality. They are not responsible for this act as such. They are in need of protection, first of all, but also support if they want to exit prostitution. This is a very important element. That means that state takes the responsibility of supporting the women economically, materially, but also, for example, if they're undocumented, giving them documented status so that they're not treated as illegal migrants by the state.
Yeah. And those held accountable would be the profiteers, the pimps and the sex buyers.
Yes, exactly. So we decriminalize the women and we place responsibility where it belongs on the two actors. It's the buyers, the final users, and the third parties or the pimps who make profit out of it.
Yeah.
They would be subjected either to administrative fines, or to criminal fines and jail time.
And Anna, before I let you go, I know that there are a lot of comrades, friends, feminists who use that argument that says that activists who perceive women in prostitution as victims think of themselves as people who stand on a higher moral ground or suffer from the savior complex, or are even encouraging a conservative agenda, or maybe even are Puritans in disguise. Like, we hear this a lot. How would you respond to that argument?
First of all, with a smile, because I find it very funny. Because I think it's the only area of human rights where all of a sudden the name or the status victim is treated in some kind of, I don't know, degrading or moralistic, or those who use these terms, they're supposed to be on a higher moral ground. I mean, try applying this to victims of domestic violence. Why don't we start calling them, or they're perfectly empowered women who made a choice to remain in an abusive relationship. It's fantastic. I mean, we don't do this, right? Well, at least I hope we don't. So, and if you take any other area where there is a legal status, because victimhood or victim is not an identity, it is not some kind of personality, it is a legal status. This is what's very important to understand. You know, if I got robbed and I go to the police and I want to file a complaint and I want the guy who stole my money to be in jail and I want compensation for moral damages and material damages, who I am a victim. But if the police tell me I'm just an empowered individual who handed out my wallet because I made this choice myself to be in a dark street on that particular moment, then I receive nothing. So it's the same with prostitution. It's absolutely ridiculous to say that calling somebody a victim, which is a term accepted by international law, all the international conventions, all 11 of them, the core human rights treaties that deal with violation of human rights. There is no violation if there is no victim and there is no perpetrator.
Yeah.
So it's very simple, legally speaking. It's an important term. Of course, women who were in prostitution and who exited prostitution and who became public advocates for the abolition of prostitution, we have a strong movement. They call themselves survivors, not only victims, but survivors. And this signifies another element to this story, that they managed to survive inherently abusive situations, violent, and nevertheless, they didn't get broken, they didn't give up, and they, you know, like survivors of domestic violence, like survivors of rape. So there is victim and there is survivors. These are the two terms, both important. Victim is more important from a legal perspective because you don't really find the word survivor in a legal vocabulary and in courts and police.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's it.
Thank you for all of this, Anna. I wanted to cover pornography and other issues, also issues of the right and the left, and the question of building alliances, including with feminists we might not agree with on this issue, but we need to work together on other issues. Like, there are lots of complex issues to navigate. But yeah, this is the time that we have with you, and I'm really grateful that you dedicated it
Thank you very much for inviting me.
to Noon, and hope to see you soon. And thank you everyone for listening and following. See you soon.